Hi, I'm Denise with Romantic Recollections. Today I want to talk about 18th century passementerie and fringed trims, or what we commonly call fly fringe today. Now, before I get too deep into this topic, I thought I'd start with a video on the terminology. Some of you may have already noticed that when posting about this or talking about my class, I don't call this fly fringe, and I wanted to talk a little bit about why that is. First off, what is passementerie? This is a French term that dates back to at least the 17th century to describe an entire family of trims, edgings, rosettes, tassels, and other decorative elements. It's still used today to describe the trims used in the upholstery trade, though sadly, most of these modern trims just aren't the same quality or delicacy of the original ones we're talking about in the 18th century. So what is fly fringe? In modern usage, fly fringe is the term used to describe a very specific style of narrow passementerie that was hugely popular in the 1760s and 70s for decorating women's gowns. Most often, it was a narrow braid that was applied to both edges of a self-fabric trim that was then pleated or gathered and applied to the gown. However, fly fringe isn't an 18th century term for these styles of trimmings. The earliest reference I've seen to that term is from a dictionary that was published in 1889. And while I'm not a stickler for historical accuracy, I do find it a little strange to use a term that was more than 100 years late to the party. So where did we get the term fly fringe? That's really not clear. One possibility is the resemblance to fly fishing lures. They're both made with strands of knotted silk, and they do have a resemblance to each other. Another possibility is that there was simply an error in translation. The French term for this trim is sourcils d'hanneton, which translates to the eyebrows of the cockchafer beetle or the maybug. And they do have these little fringed appendages that look a lot like the fringes we're talking about. So maybe someone got their flying insects mixed up and beetle eyebrows became fly fringe. Who knows? It's anyone's guess. So why wasn't this French term more widely used? I don't really have an answer to that. 18th century European fashion is full of French terminology, but we seem to have missed this one. The French used this phrase from at least the 1730s and well into the 1920s, so it's not like it got lost along the way. And it is a bit tricky to pronounce, but in that case I simply would have expected some sort of term based on a mispronunciation rather than nothing. So what did they call it in the 18th century? In English, they just called it fringe or trimming. It really doesn't seem to have a more specific name, which unfortunately also makes it really hard to research. However, the biggest reason that I avoid using the term fly fringe is because, in my mind, the fringe itself isn't really the most defining characteristic of these trims. There are plenty of gowns from this era that have narrow passementerie trim without any fringe at all, and there are others that have really elaborate embellishments, but there are other types of silk floss trims that aren't knotted into little fringes. So the fringed examples are popular and pretty, but they're really related to all these other examples. So I like to describe them as the family that they fall into rather than focusing on a single detail. Think about this like braiding hair. We have terms for different styles of braids, like maybe a French braid or a 3 or 4 strand braid. And if you add flowers or ribbons to that braid, it doesn't really change the underlying structure of the braid. You don't suddenly put flowers in a French braid and call it an entirely new made-up name like flower hair. And I feel like that's what we do with these 18th century passementerie trims. Once somebody puts that knotted fringe in there, suddenly it's fly fringe. And that doesn't really make sense to me because the underlying structure is still the same as other passementerie that doesn't happen to have the fringe. So just like you would still describe a braid by the structure, how many strands it has, how you're forming it, I like to do the same thing with these passementerie trims. That way I can be clear about which type of trim I'm talking about, and the fringe is just an embellishment that makes it prettier and makes it more unique, but it isn't really the defining characteristic that I'm focusing on. Similarly, it feels really strange to me to group different constructions of trims under one heading of fly fringe, especially since there are examples of 2 incredibly similar trims on 2 different gowns, and the only difference is that one has fringe and one doesn't. It doesn't make sense to me to split those up into 2 categories of non-fly fringe and fly fringe when the construction method is almost identical and it's just the embellishment that has changed. If we take this gown from the V&A as an example, it's extensively trimmed with passementerie and puffs of self-fabric trim. I think most of us would say it fits the style of embellishment from this time period. We may even describe this gown as being trimmed with fly fringe. But if you zoom in and really look at the trim itself, you'll notice that it gets a little bit tricky. The trim is made of puffs of silk with a chenille picot. However, there's not any actual fringe worked into this trim. If we use fly fringe as the defining characteristic, does this gown qualify? I would have to say no, this isn't fly fringe, but it is passementerie. You'll also notice that this gown has tassels made out of knotted silk fringe and chenille. Now, does a tassel qualify as fly fringe, or is that only used for the longer strands of trimming used on a gown? Again, it feels like it gets a little bit tricky if we're trying to define what exactly fly fringe is. Here's another gown from the V&A that has very similar trim. It's also made of puffs of silk with a picot edge, but it includes small knotted fringes. This one could definitely be called fly fringe. However, the two trims are made during the same era using the same construction techniques, and they're used in the same method on the gowns themselves. It seems really strange to me to use the fringe as the defining characteristic rather than focusing on the similarities in construction and usage. So when I'm talking about these trims and embellishments, you'll most often hear me use the term passementerie. This is accurate whether I'm talking about a woven trim, a puffed trim, tassels, and all sorts of other embellishments. When I'm talking about the little X-shaped fringes that we associate with this era, I often say knotted fringe because I don't have a better term, and it helps differentiate it from the woven fringes that were used on gowns in later eras. This is still a little bit vague since there are other styles of knotted fringe as well, for example, when they knot the fringe at the ends of shawls. However, until there's better documentation about a period term, this is what I'm choosing to use. So does this mean that you shouldn't use the term fly fringe? I think that's really completely up to you. Even I use it sometimes because it's such convenient shorthand for this particular style of trimming from this particular era. People know what you mean when you say fly fringe, and when you start talking about different styles of passementerie, they may go, what are you talking about? So it really depends on your audience. As a teacher, I try to be really precise in my language, so I lean more towards the technical terms rather than the terms in modern usage like fly fringe, but that doesn't mean that you have to make the same choice. However, I do invite you to explore the nuances of these trims because as you research them more and understand what the differences between styles are and how they're made, you might also decide that you prefer the term passementerie rather than fly fringe because it's simply more accurate or because it gets what you're trying to express across in a clearer way. My next video is going to go into all those varieties in much more depth with illustrations, and so I hope you'll learn a lot from that one. Until then, thank you so much for watching this video. I look forward to sharing more with you about this topic in the future. If you have other questions about 18th century passementerie, go ahead and leave them below, and I will either try to answer them in the comments or include them in a future video. If you want more information right away, you can check out my Patreon, where I'm sharing my historical research notes about passementerie with subscribers at the historian tier and above, or you can check out my full online class, which has all those research notes and museum examples, as well as all the construction techniques for all the different variations that I've uncovered. You can also check out my Pinterest board just to look through hundreds of examples of passementerie that I have found. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.